My guest at this time is Adam Andrzejewski. He's the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. We've spoken with him several times to discuss the nation's debt problem and the proclivity of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to add spending but rarely decrease it. Fiscal watchdogs contend that may very well be the case again this week, at least in the U.S. Senate, where just 22 members supported Senator Rand Paul's Pennies Plan, which calls for 2% spending cuts each year over 5 years. And Adam, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, great to be on the program, Greg. Thank you very much for your interest in our work. I think the main question we got to put on the table right away is what government agency is running well? And we're going to advocate a war on waste here at OpenTheBooks.com, with our national debt exceeding $22 trillion and our budget deficit on an annual basis over $1 trillion. We have to go after waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse.
Well, let's dig into that in just a moment. Let's talk about the specifics of this particular bill. What do we know about the Pennies Plan? I talked about how it would cut 2% each year over 5 years, but is this a fairly simple bill, a more complicated bill with other provisions? What exactly were lawmakers voting on here?
Well, to Senator Paul's credit, it was a pretty straightforward bill. As you mentioned, 2%, pennies, budget cuts, but additionally it would have expressly protected Social Security from those cuts, included instructions to make the individual income tax reforms passed by President Trump permanent and expand access to health savings accounts. So it was a pretty straightforward bill.
And what we saw was a vote of 69 to 22 defeating this. There were 9 senators that weren't there. All 43 Democrats present voted against it, and so did a majority of the Republicans present by a vote of 26 to 22 among the GOP. So how do you interpret this lopsided vote?
So, I think that the Washington Examiner said it best, that it was a, quote, nice decade of Republicans pretending to care about our $22 trillion national debt and multi-trillion-dollar annual dollar deficits. But as of Monday, when this vote was taken, we can safely say that era is now over.
Where are we on this, and why do you think we don't see greater urgency? You talked about $22 trillion, and I realize that's a number that most of us can't even fathom because we've never seen $22 trillion of anything, I don't think, except maybe grains of sand if we go to a really big beach. But right now, both parties claim that they hate it. They especially hate it when the president's from the opposition party. But yet when they have the opportunity to do much about it, other than a little bit of noise around the time of sequestration, there just hasn't been any commitment to do it. Why not?
So I think the big spending patronage Republicans are now in control of the levers, at least in the United States Senate, with killing this very, very reasonable bill put forward by Senator Paul on 2% of spending. Look, we've advocated a war on waste, the president to lead that war on waste, and he's actually adopted prong 2 of our plan. We put this open letter to the president on the in section 1 of USA Today and the Wall Street Journal. Step 1 was to open the books in as real time as possible and show us where the dollars were being spent. Number 2 was to cut 5% of discretionary spending in terms of waste, fraud, corruption, and taxpayer abuse. And prong 3 was to report to the American people. In the president's budget, as submitted, his wishes to Congress on the budget, he's adopted the 5-penny cut. Rand Paul's bill that was voted down by a majority of Republicans in the U.S. Senate this week was a 2% cut. So President Trump is way out in front of this issue, much further out in front than even the Republicans in the United States Senate.
We're talking with Adam Andrzejewski, CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. And Adam, I know we've talked about this before, but lay it out for our listeners again. With so much debt and so much overspending, even on an annual basis, where would you actually begin to try and trim things?
So on an annual basis, grant making in the federal agencies amounts to over $600 billion. And it's a target-rich environment. To put that amount of money in perspective, that's nearly as much money as we spend at the Department of Defense on our military budget every single year. We've identified absolutely crazy wasteful grants. For example, Cornell University took $1 million to study where it hurts the most to be stung by a bee. NASA gave $1 million grant to prepare the nation's religion for the discovery of extraterrestrial life. Health and Human Services doled out $1.4 million to California prostitutes on a sex ed class where the prostitutes, certainly they could have probably taught the class. $9.2 million went to the Shishi Little Airport at the private island at Martha's Vineyard. It is a target-rich environment to begin the process of honing federal spending. If you remember, Greg, back in the 1980s, President Reagan commissioned the Grace Commission, and they found that $1 out of every $3 in total was wasted. And nobody feels that situation is better today.
So getting rid of 2 cents on the dollar when you've got $600 billion in bloat doesn't seem like much of a challenge then.
Well, it doesn't. And we also know this from our oversight report at openthebooks.com, where we took a look at the use it or lose it federal spending spree in the last month of fiscal year 2018, when the federal agencies blew through $100 billion worth of contract spending in the last month. $53 billion was blown out the door in the last week. And that was about 10% of all contracts on the year went out the door in the last week. When you take a look at numbers like that, that makes Rand Paul's legislation to cut 2% of spending look very, very modest.
I know what you mean by the use it or lose it spending. I had a friend who used to work in a government mail room, and he said September was the worst month of the year because that's when everybody was ordering everything they possibly could to justify the budget they had and therefore justify the budget they wanted to get for the next fiscal year. And so it really is something that takes place in a lot of different departments every year.
Well, and we found that, it was so crazy that the Pentagon spent $4.6 million in the last month on lobster tail and snow crab. And look, we found the Pentagon with other waste and other reports. The Pentagon was purchasing coffee cups for its fighter pilots, and these cups cost $1,200 per cup. Look, all the different agencies have room to tighten the belt. In our latest report on the Department of Education, we found $11 billion over the course of the last 2 years was paid out to students on their student loans and Pell Grants on an improper basis. It was overpaid. 8% of all Pell Grants were overpaid and 4% of student loans. A 2% cut is very, very milquetoast, and the Republicans and the Democrats, they missed the boat on this one.
We're talking with Adam Andrzejewski, CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. And Adam, a lot of folks will tell you, and they certainly have a point, is that we can look at all this stuff on the periphery, but ultimately if you're really going to get a handle on federal spending, you got to address entitlements. And we've just seen reports that I think Medicare is expected to go broke about 6 years from now, and Social Security about 16, maybe even less than that from now. And so ultimately, the more people who are retiring, the more people who are on Medicare and Social Security in particular, but also Medicaid, with that expanding in many different states around the country, that's where things have to be addressed. So how big of a crisis are we looking at there, and what do we do about it?
Well, it's a big crisis, Greg, and here's where you start. You kick the dead people off the rolls. Last year, our analysis of improper payments showed that dead people received $1 billion in benefits, and the biggest programs that were the offenders doling out this money was Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security payments, and also the federal retirement annuity payouts that kept flowing to dead recipients. So I think you start there. But you're exactly right. On Medicaid and Medicare, it is a huge problem, and there's an abject lack of basic in-house financial controls within these large federal programs. If you remember, when the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2012, improper payments was an area that was going to help pay for the ACA by rooting out the waste, fraud, corruption, and taxpayer abuse. And it never happened. In fact, the improper payments within those agencies soared. In 2012, they were $64 billion, and today they're $85 billion.
So what do you tell voters, Adam? They sent a lot of these folks to Washington. Some of them have made good on their promises. Others haven't. So what do you do the next time elections come around?
Well, the American people are always underestimated, and corruption and the fiscal issues are off the charts in every single poll that you look at. It outpolls many of the other issues of the day, including immigration. It rivals health care on the polling results and a lot of other public policy issues. So we the people need to raise our voice. We need to take our voice into the ballot box. When these things become voting issues, we will get better public policy out of the United States Senate.
Adam, we'll have to call time there. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much for your interest in our work.
Adam Andrzejewski is the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.